I'm Paul Ducklin, this is Naked Security Live, and let me just see. Yes, Andy, thank you Andy, that's great. I was so confident at the beginning that I'd done everything carefully, had a glance down, didn't see the green light. So we're good to go. As you can see, today's topic is to Zoom or not to Zoom, and then in brackets afterwards said how to do it safely. I assume that many, if not most of us, whatever reservations we may have about online conferencing in general or Zoom in particular, we're probably going to be using Zoom or a similar service these days for very obvious reasons related to working from home and coronavirus. It's a fantastic way to stay in touch, but as we all know, getting your Zoom settings wrong can be very costly in terms of embarrassment and reputation. I know we visited this, I think it was at the very beginning of April, that was just after lockdown started in the UK, when there was a lot of fuss about, oh golly, we're all going to need to use Zoom, what could possibly go right? And we put out 5 tips. I want to revisit them because if you have been following the news this week, you will know that there was a hearing in Florida, 17-year-old youngster who's been arrested and charged, one of 3 people charged for the recent Twitter hack. He went for a bail hearing. He was supposed to pay $725 to get out of custody. He wanted to argue that that should be lower. In the end, he was unsuccessful, but not, as you will have seen, with a lot of controversy and trouble. The courts in the US are supposed to be a matter of public record. They're not meant to be secret. So the remote parts, it was done via Zoom and people were allowed to join in. It was easy to find out the meeting ID. And unfortunately, that meeting wasn't controlled for audio and video. Now, as you know, in a courtroom, if someone suddenly stands up and starts ranting, the cops or the security guards will be on them in a trice. They'll be carted off. They'll be facing their own court hearing in a minute. If somebody jumps up and starts stripping themselves naked in the middle of the courtroom, they'll be dealt with too. But when you're dealing with people remotely over Zoom, you need to kind of protect yourself from that in advance. And as you probably saw on the news, sadly, what happened in that Florida virtual courtroom is people who joined in suddenly started playing loud music to blast over the court hearings. I heard a bit of a recording where someone came in and started this massive rant about the judiciary and Freemasonry, all sorts of stuff, just ranting in the background. And as you can probably imagine, it was going to happen sooner rather than later. Somebody decided it would be a fantastic idea to scream pornography in the middle of the hearing. So it all ended in kind of tatters. The hearing did get finished. The last bit I heard was just before it finished is the judge saying, and at the next hearing, it will be password protected. What a pity they didn't think of that this time. So that's brought this whole idea of how do you make sure that you don't fall victim to what's now known as Zoom bombing, a new word in our vocabulary. And I thought it's an ideal time to go through my 5 tips. So I'll try and go through them as quickly as possible, not take as long as I usually do on the Facebook Live, although I always say that and I never manage it. Let me try this time. You probably know where I'm going to start. Point number 1, this is not specific to Zoom. It works for everything across your operating system and your apps, but it's particularly opposite to Zoom, and that is patch early, patch often. If you started using Zoom at the beginning of lockdown and you downloaded it and you haven't checked to make sure that you've updated, please do so. Zoom, to their credit, after some criticism for security problems back in March and April timeframe, they actually had a feature freeze on their product. They decided they're going to concentrate on security improvements. They have made many, not just bug fixes, but also improvements to things like more randomness in random meeting IDs and things like that. And that means that if you're still using an old version of the software, you have greatly missed out. So whatever remote working or teleconferencing system you're using, make sure you've got the latest version. You might as well check every time you start it up. It doesn't take long. Just checking a comment here. Irony, watching a Facebook video live about whether to use Zoom securely. Well, yeah. With Facebook Live, it's a little bit different because it's kind of me talking to you and you can put in comments. You can't suddenly share your screen. It's not designed. Facebook Live is, fortunately for me, it's designed for me to talk to the world, not for the world to interact with me other than via comments. Zoom is designed to be a little bit different, where you, in a typical meeting or teleconferencing, you do see everybody, and if you're not careful, anybody can suddenly become the main participant, kind of take over or subvert it, put in their own audio, their own video, or make a mess of the whole thing. That's a little bit less likely in Facebook Live. So perhaps it's not ironic, but yes, it's certainly amusing. So number one is make sure you're running the latest version. Zoom has done an awful lot to improve its security in the last weeks and months. You might as well have the latest version. What is the point of using an old version by mistake if you don't have to? The second thing to remember is that and many people, if they started using Zoom a while ago, they may not have got used to this. I've been into Zoom meetings recently, semi-public ones, where people haven't used these features. I think they're great. Zoom calls them waiting room, and there's also an option that's host that the host has to admit each person individually. Now that may not be what you want, but it can be a great feature. The idea of waiting room is it means that it's probably not what you want for work meetings where you have 10 people, they've all been invited. You don't mind if they join in the meeting before the host arrives and they start chatting to each other. They all know each other. They'll recognize people who aren't supposed to be there. But for something that's public, you probably don't want that, because if it's a meeting that you are holding under your banner, under your brand, if you like, and people are able to chat and interact with each other before you as the host get there, then it's not clear to people who are attending from outside really who's in charge of the meeting. That could be bad for your reputation. So the waiting room means that you get to decide when the meeting starts and the doors open and everyone gets admitted. And there's also an option where if somebody wants to join the meeting, they have to say, I request admission, and the host has to say yes. Now for public, for marketing, Zooming, where you want people to join in, you probably don't want that. But for work meetings, it's a great idea because you can make sure that people don't show up who aren't supposed to be there. And it means that you know when people are joining and you get to choose the point at which they join in. Checking another comment. Jay, Zoom now has a mix of automatic and manual updates. So once you're updated, you should stay reasonably updated. Yes, that's true. Most products these days have automatic updating, whether it's operating system or app level, but it does absolutely no harm for every app, including Zoom, to find out where the check for updates button is and to click it regularly. That way it goes and checks for an update. If you have missed one, it will then say, there is an update, would you like to get it? And what that means is, if it says, don't worry, you're up to date, then at least you know that automatic updating is working. So automatic updates, turn them on if you can, if that's appropriate for you. It's a great idea, but don't then go, oh, well, I can set and forget, I never need to check, because the last thing you want is to be relying on them and they're broken and you never find out because you never go and check. Hello, Duck from Pennsylvania. And Sebastian, long time no see. Hi, Sebastian. Teresa says Frozen. Well, you're from Ottawa and it's only August, so I don't know whether that means weather or your Facebook feed. I hope it's by now neither of those, but welcome back, Teresa. So we've had patch early, patch often. We've had look for options, like in Zoom, they're called waiting room and host to admit, that give you control over when the meeting starts and who can join in. By the way, Zoom also has a feature, so this is tip 2.5 if you like. Zoom also has a feature where once you've got going with a meeting, if there's not really much point in someone joining in late because the beginning's like an important part and you don't really want to hear the opinion of someone who doesn't know what the meeting is all about, you can also lock the meeting so people can't join thereafter. If it's that important and it's a work meeting, they could always message one of the people in the meeting and say, could you ask the host to let me in or to unlock it temporarily? But the idea of lock the meeting, the good thing about that is if you expect the meeting to have a specific size and you've admitted the people you want, then you don't have to worry about anyone else who isn't supposed to be there wandering in later. So those are the things about controlling when the meeting starts, who joins and when they can join. That's tip number 2. Teresa said, yeah, participants had to stay in a waiting room until you were matched with a profile pic, which had to be, then it says see more. But so I can't read your whole comment, Teresa, but it's a great idea. The idea of waiting room is that it just means that, it means that you're not letting people into the main auditorium and you're not letting them chat and let somebody with the gift of the gab look as though they're in control of things and maybe say stuff that you would like to contradict, or maybe you'd even like to kick them out. So don't let people have a meeting of their own before you get there if that's important to you. Tip number 3 should be obvious, but people forget it. Seems that the court in Florida did, and that is make sure that you understand what controls are available for audio and video sharing, particularly in Zoom, but also in any other software you use, and use them where necessary. In particular, Zoom has options that allow you to start the meeting with everybody muted except the host, and to prevent participants from unmuting themselves, so they have to ask for permission in some way first. I recommend you do that even if you trust everybody in the meeting, because there's always somebody, even in a small meeting, who insists on pretending they're part of the meeting but typing away on a keyboard somewhere, and unfortunately, if they're using the microphone in their computer, it kind of sounds like they're sitting at home firing off an AR-15. It makes a terribly loud noise. So muting everybody is a great idea just because it stops noise pollution in the meeting, but it also stops somebody going on a rant that you didn't expect, and then you're trying to find who it is and control them. So I would start with everybody muted, and if it's a meeting where you have participants that you don't know and you want them to join in, then don't allow them to unmute themselves. And if you don't want them to unmute themselves, then you certainly don't want them to be able to decide that they want to start sharing their screen. And Zoom provides an easy way for you to control that too. We've seen several Zoom bombing stories, and you can imagine the kind of stuff that people choose to share. It's usually going to be offensive. They probably think it's tremendously funny, but it's not good for your reputation, and it's not good for the eyeballs or the retinas of people in your meeting. So I would recommend that you start with audio and video sharing locked down for everybody else, and if somebody needs to take over audio, then you as the host can let them do it. Therese is saying, a different meeting hosted muted mics and cameras until participant asked to speak. We could still type. Yeah, so my reason for muting audio is actually that the background noise of somebody where they don't realize there's just enough noise to keep triggering their mic so Zoom thinks they're speaking, that can be terribly disruptive because it ruins the audio stream. And often with many laptop mics, if no one's talking but there's background noise, they'll automatically lift their gain to try and pick up what little noise there is. That's why keystrokes sound like machine gun fire, because it's picking up the keys actually activating inside the computer. So that's tip number 3. Tip number 4, particularly for Zoom, I recommend that you don't always use your personal meeting ID. Zoom, when you create Zoom, it generates a random, I think it's an 11-digit number now, that's your meeting ID. Now, I know people who they've just memorized that long ago, and they just always use the same meeting ID, and you come into their meetings and they use the same meeting at this hour that they did the hour before. That all gets terribly confusing. If you do decide to use your personal meeting ID, which kind of you have to consider essentially a matter of public record after you've used it a couple of times, then Zoom has an option that lets you set a meeting password, and you can go in and change that before you start the meeting. That way, anyone who does stumble upon or even after you finish your meeting, you can put in a new password for next time. That means that anyone who stumbles across your meeting ID has to know the password that you get to choose. It also gives you a sort of, for small meetings, it gives you a sort of 2FA if you like, because anyone you want to invite to a meeting, when you've set the password, you can send them that password not over Zoom but via some other means. So you might send them an email saying join me in the meeting, and then you might send them an IM or a text message with the password in. That way it gives you good control over who's able to connect to the meeting at all. And if you use just start a meeting with a random meeting ID, that's an 11-digit number. You can publicize it for one meeting, but once that meeting's over and done with, you won't have to worry about somebody stumbling into the next meeting because the random meeting ID will be different. Paul, I don't know whether you say, is that Draga? I just scrolled off, Paul. It's worth watching out for email, calendar and instant messaging notifications popping up when you are screen sharing. And Robert Huffman with a giant smiley, that's capital D, and close your private browser tabs. That isn't on my list of tips. I'm going to add that as a combined tip as tip 3 3/4. It's a great idea. If you're invited to share your screen in the meeting, then make sure you share either one app or just close everything. I use Linux where I can have, and I use a window manager where I can have multiple separate virtual desktops. and I've noticed with Zoom that it only shares stuff off the desktop I'm on, so I make sure I use a blank one before I say I want to share my screen. That way the stuff that's on my main screen isn't going to show up to anyone else. Believe me, the stuff, and by the way, this used to be a problem in regular presentations, of course. You've probably all sat through seminars and conferences in real life where somebody's giving a talk and they're talking and talking and suddenly a message comes up and you know that they haven't seen it yet, and you know that when they see it they're going to be terribly embarrassed because it doesn't have much to do with work. So that's a great idea. Make sure that you're not oversharing if you are invited to share your screen. Jay Gorman is saying separate desktops is also available for Mac and Windows. Yes, I forget what they call it on Mac. Screens, is it? Something like that. And I don't doubt that you can do it on Windows these days. It's a great idea, but of course, in many operating systems and for many window managers, notifications, you can set them so that they pop up on all windows. I have that in my Linux window manager. I can have windows where I can, if I'm not careful, I can say, oh, I want these to appear everywhere. So make sure you haven't done that. If you do go to a separate desktop, make sure that you aren't going to display something that you don't expect. If worst comes to the worst, if you've got a spare laptop, then use that for your conference call and your screen sharing, and make sure that you have nothing open. So then you can close your email, you can close your IM, you can just connect to the teleconference, to the remote working session. I've done I think I did tip number 4, which is about using random meeting IDs or setting meeting ID passwords. In other words, don't use the same meeting IDs over and over and over again, and just because you will get people joining in, because we know that miscreants and crooks alike go out hunting for meeting IDs so that they can join in, so that they can have what they call fun. And the last tip, this isn't really about cybersecurity, but it makes cybersecurity in remote working and in Zoom type meetings much easier. And that is about what you might call etiquette. If you're meeting, whether it's family and friends or whether it's business meeting, but particularly for business meetings, make your own rules of conduct and make sure you stick to them. So, you know, for example, if it's a business meeting, you can kind of don't show up with maybe the bottom part of your clothing missing because it seems like it doesn't matter, just in case. Make sure that you have such professionalism as is necessary and that you conduct yourself following those rules. And the reason for that is A, it's much more fun and much more polite for everyone else, but B, perhaps even more importantly, it means that someone who isn't supposed to be in the meeting is much more likely to stand out, because if they make a breach of the etiquette, it's not that you go, ooh, I don't like you very much, it's, hey, is that person supposed to be here? So it can clue you into the fact that somebody who doesn't belong in the meeting has managed to get in by mistake. And by the way, part of that tip number 5 is if you plan to record the meeting in advance, or more importantly, if you plan not to record the meeting in advance, then state that to everybody in the meeting. Now, I know that people can take screenshots, they can take pictures with a mobile phone, they can set a screen recorder on that has nothing to do with the Zoom app itself, so people can record screenshots. But if it is your intention they should not, just make that absolutely clear up front, so everyone at least knows what the rules are, and anyone who goes against them knows that they're being a naughty boy or girl. So I think that's not exactly cybersecurity, but it does make it easier for you to spot cybersecurity breaches. Oh, sorry, the comment is the one I just answered about separate desktops on Mac and Windows. So I'll finish, folks, by just whipping through those 5 tips for Zoom in particular, and for teleconferencing, remote working, meeting friends and family online, screen sharing apps, whatever. Is number 1, patch early, patch often. Don't be left behind by a system that's less secure than everybody else in the call. You could let them down, and it's so easy to get up to date these days that there's no excuse for not checking. Tip number 2, use Zoom's waiting room or host to admit participants, and optionally the lock meeting down against new people joining in, or use the equivalent settings in whatever app you use, because it gives you much better control over when the meeting starts, who gets to join and who gets to sneak in later. That means it's much less likely that you'll have a breach like what happened in the Florida case. Tip number 3 is make sure that whatever app you use, in particular for Zoom, because Zoom bombing really is a thing these days, know and understand how to use the controls available for sharing audio and video. In other words, Don't let participants who join in just unmute their own audio if that's not what you want, and make sure that you don't let people share their screen unless that's really, really what you intend. Maybe pass screen sharing ability to them if and when they need it, and only then. Tip number 4 is don't have a meeting ID that's predictable and just use it every single time for every meeting, because you will end up on a list that people who shouldn't be in your meetings, it means that they will keep trying and they will keep trying, and they don't have to try and 11 digits worth of numeric space if they know where to start. So either use random meeting IDs in Zoom or use your personal meeting ID but set a different password every time. And lastly, set some rules for etiquette and conduct behaviour during the meeting, in particular relating to whether or not you expect what is discussed in the meeting to be made public afterwards. Expect everyone to stick to them, and that way, A, you will enjoy your meetings with everyone else much more, and you won't have any surprises because people who shouldn't be there will stand out much more easily. So thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. As one of our commenters said, it's an hour to talk about Zoom on Facebook Live, but Zoom has been a great blessing to many people during lockdown. Just don't let it become a thorn in your side. So thanks for listening, and until next time, stay secure.